Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about the Complete Elemental Shaman Guide for Season 2, Patch 12.1. I'm going to cover a lot, so this video is likely going to be pretty long, but I have put timestamps to every section, so if there's something specific that you're looking for, feel free to skip around. As always, everything in this guide is subject to change depending on Blizzard's tuning, so keep that in mind as the patch develops. If you want the most up-to-date versions of this guide as things change throughout the season, make sure to subscribe and check out my Discord linked in the description below because that's where I'll post all the important updates. But with that out of the way, let's jump into it. Right now, the expected meta for pretty much everything is Farseer over Stormbringer, which is basically the exact opposite of where we started Midnight, and a big reason for that comes down to the tuning changes. Both Tempest and our Mastery overloads took a big nerf moving into 12.1, and that naturally hurt Stormbringer a lot because a bunch of that build's value was tied into, obviously Tempest, but more so the overloads. Farseer obviously got hit by the overloads nerfs as well, but not nearly as hard because a large portion of that hero talent's damage is tied to our ancestors instead of our overloads. And on top of that, Ancestor's Chain Lightning now hits 5 targets instead of 3, which gives Farseer a much stronger damage profile in multi-target and makes the hero tree look really good going into the season. As a Stormbringer enjoyer, that makes me a bit sad, but honestly, it's probably pretty good for most people. Farseer is simply easier to play than Stormbringer. It's much less rigid, slightly more mobile, and it's much more forgiving when you make rotational mistakes. So if you've been thinking about picking up Elemental for 12.1, it's actually a pretty approachable time to do that. Elemental really boils down to just two things: Maelstrom management and cooldown usage. On the Maelstrom side, you just want to consistently generate Maelstrom and convert it into spenders without overtapping. And then on the cooldown side, you want to get as much value out of those as possible, and not just because they're your cooldowns because, duh, that's obvious, but also because those are the tools that summon your ancestors. The 12.1 tuning did push more of our damage into our baseline kit, so the spec is a little bit more consistent, actually a lot more consistent outside of cooldowns than it was before. But good cooldown usage is still incredibly important if you actually want to get the most out of this spec. But enough about that, let's get into the details. For the class tree, this is generally going to be my go-to setup, but this is also the part of the build that can change the most dungeon to dungeon. A lot of the points here are utility based, so depending upon the specific dungeon or encounter you're going into, you can absolutely move a few points around. That said, this is the baseline I would recommend starting with, especially because this is such a poison heavy season. Because of that, we really need to have a point in Poison Cleansing Totem. If you need access to more utility options, the easiest place to pull points out of would be the Winds of Alakir talent. This gives you a little bit more freedom to pick things up like Jetstream, Totemic Surge, or whatever other utility talent makes sense for whatever you're running. I'll also come back to these in a little bit more detail once we get into other sections of this guide. Now let's move on to Raid Talents. This build is actually incredibly similar to what we're already playing in Season 1, with really the biggest difference just being that we're now playing Farseer instead of Stormbringer. The core of the single target build is still built around something we were already doing before with Master of the Elements. After casting Lava Burst, Master of the Elements buffs your next spell, so a lot of the gameplay is about using Lava Burst to set up stronger cast of things like Elemental Blast, rather than just pressing everything independently. It's the same lava weaving that we've been doing forever and is really just the main rotational impact talent in Raid. We also swap out Aftershock for Tectonic Collapse. In Season 1, Aftershock was incredibly valuable because those Maelstrom refunds directly translated into more spenders. But with our 12.1 tier set that already gives us a lot more additional free spenders, we don't need Aftershock nearly as much anymore. Instead, Tectonic Collapse gives us a much more consistent damage setup and also empowers our free spenders as well, giving us additional value. And then from there, we pick up Power of the Maelstrom, which was changed in 12.1. Instead of giving you additional overloads, your Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning now have a 15% chance to empower your next Lava Burst by 20%. This fits really naturally into this build because Lava Burst is already such an important part of the rotation with Master of the Elements. It adds a little bit more synergy to the rotation without actually giving us another mechanic we need to actively manage. And then finally, we pick up Earthen Rage and Flame Tongue Weapon to lean a little harder into our fire damage. All these talents are mostly passive throughput nodes, so aside from Master of the Elements and a few talent changes that focus around the new tier set, there really isn't much to relearn here. If you played the Season 1 raid build, most of this tree will feel extremely familiar. Now let's move over to the Mythic Plus build. If you played Farseer in Season 1 Mythic Plus, this is basically the exact same build. There is really not much here structurally different. So rather than compare it to the Farseer from Season 1, because that wasn't necessarily meta, let's compare it to Stormbringer because that's really the more useful comparison. Aside from the obvious hero talent swap over to Farseer, the biggest change is that we're basically taking all of those points we used to invest into the lightning side of the tree and moving them over to the fire side of the tree instead. So instead of going down things like Lightning Rod and Charged Conduit, we're instead taking Voltaic Blaze, Crackling Fury, and Purging Flames. And that's really the main and kind of only difference. Now let's get into the raid rotation, starting off with the opener. A few seconds before the pull, you want to press Stormkeeper. From there, you open up with Lava Burst to get your Master of the Elements buff, then Ancestral Guidance, and then press Ascendance alongside your trinkets and combat potions. From there, we cast Lightning Bolt to consume that earlier Master of the Elements buff, and then transition directly into our normal priority. Ideally pressing Elemental Blast as soon as possible. But once you're through that very simple opener, the single target rotation is built around a very simple priority list. At the top are your cooldowns, Stormkeeper, Ancestral Guidance, and Ascendance. Whenever possible, you want to use those together because they all feed into the same goal of maximizing your Ancestor windows. That said, don't sit on Stormkeeper forever waiting for Ascendance. If Ascendance is only a few seconds away, holding Stormkeeper briefly is completely fine. But if they're desynced by more than a couple of seconds, just send Stormkeeper and keep getting uses throughout that fight. After cooldowns then, our next priority is to maintain Flame Shock. You generally want to refresh it once it drops below around 6 seconds to make use of that pandemic window. From there, we then Lava Burst as long as Flame Shock is up, and if we don't already have a Master of the Elements buff waiting. After that, we then spend Maelstrom with Elemental Blast, and if none of those priorities are available, then you fill with Lightning Bolt. The one important rule in this rotation is Master of the Elements. Whenever possible, you want that buff going into Elemental Blast. So if Elemental Blast is coming up and you can fit a Lava Burst beforehand, do it. But don't completely stall your rotation trying to force that interaction. If you can't reasonably set up an Elemental Blast with Lava Burst, just consume Master of the Elements with Lightning Bolt and keep that rotation moving. Now for Raid AoE, once you get to 4 or more targets, the rotation is pretty much identical with only 2 major changes. Lightning Bolt will become Chain Lightning, and Elemental Blast will become Earthquake. Everything else follows the same exact basic logic. The only caveat here is that this only applies when targets are actually close enough for Chain Lightning and Earthquake to get full value. If the pack is spread out, moving frequently, or the mobs are going to leave your Earthquake before it gets enough ticks off, then forcing that AoE rotation can actually lose you damage. In those situations, it is completely fine to keep using Elemental Blast instead. Also, I should specify Earthquake on 4 targets, Chain Lightning on 3 targets. Now let's move into the Mythic Plus rotation, starting with single target. For single target, priority is cooldowns at the top. You want to use Stormkeeper, Ancestral Guidance, and Ascendance together as often as possible, but just like in Raid, don't hold Stormkeeper for long waiting for Ascendance. After that, we then use Voltaic Blaze only to maintain Flame Shock, spend Maelstrom with Elemental Blast, use Lava Burst while Flame Shock is active, and then fill with Lightning Bolt. And that's really it. But once we move into AoE, the rotation does change quite a bit more. Your cooldown priority stays the same, but your Voltaic Blaze and Lava Burst are where the changes occur. In AoE, we are no longer sending Lava Burst whenever available. We only want to cast that spell when we have a Purging Flames buff from Voltaic Blaze. Ideally, we consume Purging Flames with a Lava Surge proc, so Lava Burst is instant and doesn't interrupt the flow of your rotation. And really, the only time you should hard cast Lava Burst in AoE is if Voltaic Blaze is about to come back off of cooldown and you still haven't consumed your current Purging Flames buff. At that point, you want to clear the buff before pressing Voltaic Blaze again so you aren't wasting that next Purging Flames proc. So the AoE Lava Burst rule is really simple. Use Lava Surge procs to consume Purging Flames whenever possible, and only hardcast Lava Burst if you're about to lose the buff because Voltaic Blaze is coming back up. Outside of that, the target count rule determines what filler and spender you're using. At 2 targets, stay with your single target rotation. At 3 targets, you swap to Chain Lightning, and then at 4 targets, you swap to Earthquake. Really though, the AoE rotation just boils down to casting Voltaic Blaze on cooldown as often as possible. Now, real quick before we get into the tier set, this is the part where a normal YouTuber would have a sponsor. Unfortunately for me, I'm not a normal YouTuber. I'm a middle-aged man with too much debt. So instead, if you want to support the channel, I've got a Patreon and YouTube memberships linked below. It's completely optional, obviously, but it does go to support the channel and help make these guides possible. Alright, incredibly successful sponsor segment out of the way, let's talk about the tier set. This is probably the biggest thing in 12.1 that actually changes how the spec feels to play. The 2-piece is pretty straightforward. It gives us some additional damage on spenders, but there isn't really anything rotational you need to think about with it, it's just passive throughput. The 4-piece is where things get a lot more interesting. Whenever Stormkeeper or Ascendance fade, you gain 2 charges that empower your next 2 builders, either Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, or Lava Burst. After you cast one of those 2 empowered builders, you gain another buff that makes your next spender, either Elemental Blast or Earthquake, completely free. The important part here about this is that the free spender buff does not stack. So you can cast 2 empowered builders back to back before using a free spender from the first one, and that second proc can overwrite the first and you'll effectively lose part of your tier set. Because of that, whenever you get those empowered builder charges, the priority is hyper important. You want to cast one builder, then immediately follow up with a spender of Elemental Blast or Earthquake, then a second builder, and then follow that up immediately with a second spender. There is also one more layer to this to think about, and that's going to be the Maelstrom management going into the end of your cooldowns. Because those spenders are free, it is technically and easily possible to end up overcapping Maelstrom, even if you're playing correctly, and sometimes there just isn't much you can do about it. But we can at least minimize how often that happens. Ideally, as Stormkeeper or Ascendance is about to end, you want to dump as much Maelstrom as you reasonably can before you start consuming those tier set charges. That way, when you cast your empowered builder and generate your free spender, you have more room to continue generating Maelstrom without immediately overcapping. And this is probably going to be one of the biggest skill checks for this class in 12.1. The tier set is incredibly finicky. The free spender buff is super easy to overwrite, and when that spec starts moving quickly during cooldowns, it can be very easy to lose track of which buff or what charge you're currently sitting on. So, if there is one rule, remember this. When your cooldowns end, dump your Maelstrom. Then alternate builder, spender, until both tier set charges are gone, or all tier set charges are gone. If you can do that consistently without overwriting your free spender buff, you're going to get significantly more value out of this tier set. For stat weights, I'm going to hold off making any super definitive claims until we have more sims and smarter people than me have time to really dig into the numbers, but for now, my general approach is going to keep a healthy amount of mastery, around 72%, and then roughly balancing haste and crit, while avoiding versatility as much as possible. I still wouldn't treat that as a strict stat priority though. Your exact weights are going to change depending upon your gear, so once sims are fully updated, simming your own character is still going to be the best answer for everyone. And really, consumables are pretty simple because of that. You generally just take whatever consumable gives you more of a stat that you need in your current setup. If you're lacking haste, get some haste enchants or flask. If you need crit, get a crit one. There really isn't much more complication there aside from that. The only one unique choice really worth mentioning is the ring enchant, where we take Eyes of the Eagle for that additional crit effectiveness on our rings. Outside of that, just build around your current stat distribution rather than chasing one universal stat priority. Okay, now let's talk about Ascendance, because even after the 12.1 tuning pass, cooldown usage is still one of the biggest things separating a good Elemental Shaman from a great one. Ascendance did get nerfed and a lot of our baseline abilities got buffed, so we are technically slightly less cooldown reliant than we were before. That said, cooldowns are still a massive part of our overall damage profile, and you can very easily see the difference between someone who uses them well and someone who doesn't. The good news here is that the punishment for imperfect Ascendance usage is a little bit lower now. If you screw up your Ascendance, you're not losing quite as much damage as you would have before because more of our throughput now exists outside of that button. But proper usage still matters more than anything else with Elemental. So the basic goal I say for newer players starting with Ascendance is that they don't want to sit on it forever waiting for a perfect moment. In most situations, you want to use it as often as possible and get as many total casts over the course of an encounter or dungeon as you can, even if they are in ideal circumstances. There are obviously situations where holding Ascendance briefly does make sense, but the default mindset should always be to send it unless you have a specific reason not to, and you can articulate that reason. If you can't articulate that reason, then you probably shouldn't bother holding Ascendance. The biggest mistake I see people tend to make is holding Ascendance for so long you lose an entire use or two of it over the course of a dungeon. So don't be afraid to waste it, you're not going to learn the capabilities of this class unless you make a mistake once in a while. Now let's talk about mobility and movement. Our main movement tool is Spirit Walker's Grace, and this is really our bread and butter when it comes to a fight that has heavy movement. The biggest thing with Spirit Walker's Grace is that you want to use it proactively, not reactively. If you know a mechanic is coming up and it's going to force you to move, or you know you need to reposition, press it before movement starts so you can keep that rotation flowing instead of just losing casts. And if you don't, when in doubt, just send it. It's much better to use Spirit Walker's Grace and get a small amount of value out of it than to try and hold it waiting for the perfect moment and end the fight barely using it at all. If you're not familiar with an encounter yet, it could even be worth just pairing it directly with Ascendance by default. Ascendance is still our most important damage window, so guaranteeing that you can keep the damage rolling through movement is often going to be way more valuable than trying to save Spirit Walker's Grace for something later. Outside of that though, we do have a few smaller movement tools. Gust of Wind is great for repositioning and getting yourself out of danger without having to spend multiple globals moving. Spirit Walk gives us a burst of movement speed and also removes a snare from us. Windrush Totem gives both us and our group additional movement speed, and with the right talent setup can remove snare effects from ourselves and our allies. And Thunderous Paws is another mobility option, giving us a burst of movement speed while also removing a snare from ourselves. A lot of snare removals for Elemental Shaman. It was very impactful last season. But now let's talk about defensives, because Elemental is still pretty darn squishy. We have decent baseline tankiness, but when it comes to our actual defensive cooldowns, we really only have one true button in Astral Shift. It gives us a 40% damage reduction on a 1.5 minute cooldown. Outside of that, we really only have Earth Elemental, which is more of a pseudo-defensive than a real one. It gives us 15% additional max health, which can definitely be helpful to survive a hit, but it's not the same kind of mitigation that Astral Shift gives. We also have the Spirit Wolf talent, which gives us a stacking 5% damage reduction while we remain in Ghost Wolf. Technically, that does give us some extra survivability when we really need it, but in practice it's very difficult to use without sacrificing a ton of damage uptime. And then there's one more defensive interaction that becomes extremely important in higher Mythic Plus, and that's Wind Shear. Normally, we already want to interrupt dangerous casts because stopping a cast means less damage to the group, right? That much is obvious. But with the Wind Veil talent, there's an extra reason Elemental Shamans should be actively looking for interrupts. Whenever we successfully interrupt a spell, Wind Veil gives us a 15% damage reduction against spell damage for 12 seconds. This means Wind Shear is effectively doing two major jobs at once. You're preventing a dangerous enemy cast from going off, and you're also giving yourself a fairly substantial damage reduction afterwards. So especially in higher keys, it's not enough to just assume someone else will get the kick. Whenever possible, you want to be the person getting those interrupts yourself, because that Wind Veil uptime can be a huge difference in how much incoming damage you're taking. And now let's finish off with a few of the most common questions I've been seeing about Elemental going into 12.1. Number 1. How long should I hold Stormkeeper for Ascendance? Generally, no longer than about 10 seconds. We want Stormkeeper and Ascendance together as often as possible, but the entire point of Elemental is getting as many cooldowns used as we can. So if Ascendance is only a few seconds away, absolutely, hold Stormkeeper and line them up. But once you start getting past roughly 10 seconds, you're usually better off just sending Stormkeeper rather than risking losing an entire use over a fight. Question 2. Why are we using Elemental Blast instead of Earthshock? This mostly comes down to damage versus mobility. Elemental Blast does more damage and gives you buffs to increase your damage further, so if you're trying to maximize your output, that's just the default choice. Earthshock does less damage, but because it's instant, it makes the spec significantly more mobile. So if you're struggling with movement, or just want a more forgiving version of the build, you can absolutely swap over to Earthshock. Just understand you are trading some damage for that extra mobility. Question 3. Do we hardcast Lava Burst? In single target, yes, Lava Burst is still a normal part of the rotation, so you will absolutely be hardcasting it. In AoE, generally no. We really only want a Lava Burst when we're consuming Purging Flames buff. Ideally, that happens through a Lava Surge proc, so the Lava Burst is instant. The exception here is if you still have a Purging Flames buff active and Voltaic Blaze is about to come off of cooldown. In that situation, you should hardcast Lava Burst to consume the existing buff before pressing Voltaic Blaze again and potentially wasting it. Question 4. When do we use Chain Lightning instead of Lightning Bolt? The answer here is 3 targets. At 2 targets, we maintain our single target rotation, but once we hit 3, we swap over our filler from Lightning Bolt to Chain Lightning. And the next question, then, is when do we use Earthquake instead of Elemental Blast, and that would be 4 targets. Once we hit 4 targets, Earthquake becomes our spender over Elemental Blast. The obvious exception here is heavy movement, however. If the targets are going to move out of your Earthquake and you're going to lose a bunch of ticks, Elemental Blast can still be the better practical option. Question 6. Do we cast Voltaic Blaze during Ascendance? As things stand, I don't believe we want to, no. Voltaic Blaze is a strong button, but during Ascendance, a huge part of our damage is coming from our ancestors and the spells they duplicate. If we cast Voltaic Blaze and then Lava Burst, our ancestors will also be casting Lava Burst for both of those spells, which are single target. In AoE, that means we're giving up 2 globals where those ancestors could instead be firing off additional Chain Lightnings. So during Ascendance, the priority is really just fit as many Chain Lightnings into that window as possible, rather than spending global setting up a Voltaic Blaze and Purging Flames combo. Question 7. Why does my damage look bad? Most of the time, this is going to come down to cooldown usage. Really look at when you're pressing Ascendance, how much value you're actually getting out of that window, and whether or not you're just holding it for too long. Elemental is a little less cooldown reliant after the 12.1 tuning changes, but Ascendance and our Ancestor windows are still a massive part of our damage. If your rotation looks mostly correct but your overall damage is still struggling, cooldown usage is likely one of the first places I would look. But that's really everything you need to get started with Elemental Shaman in 12.1. There are obviously a lot of smaller optimizations on top of that, especially with the new tier set, but if you get those fundamentals right, you're already doing the majority of what makes the spec function. And like I mentioned at the start, tuning can always change, so if anything important shifts after this video goes live, I'll keep the Discord updated with whatever changes. If you have any questions I didn't cover, or you've been testing something different in 12.1, let me know in the comments. I am always down to talk Elemental and theory craft this stuff. If this guide helped you out, make sure to like the video. It really does help the channel out a lot, and subscribe for more Elemental or general WoW content. You can also catch me live over on Twitch every now and again if you want to see the spec actually played in Raid or Mythic Plus, so feel free to drop by and say hi. And if you want to support the channel a bit more directly, you can check out the Patreon or YouTube memberships down below, and make sure to join the Discord for guide updates, questions, or everything else going forward. But yeah, that's all I got for this one. So thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.